subject.
Yes. Great. So just so you know that I want you to sit right where you are seated.
Yeah.
But I want you to know the back of your head and your shoulders are in
Yes.
the video just for your awareness.
I can absolutely shift over.
I don't need you to shift over. I would just be remiss. I would want somebody to tell me.
Yeah, I think, I think unfortunately we're more movable than the camera is. This one seemed too low, and this one was, we could get it, but it seemed aesthetically unappealing.
First,
It was just,
I would love to see you.
yeah, there we are.
interact.
That would be ideal. Yeah, if you're good with that.
So that we can, that'd be great.
That seems like a winner for us. Perfect.
Okay.
That means it's time.
That
Is that what
does.
time?
What?
Will they, what do they do typically for these book events? Do they have like?
Typically we set up and I do an opening and stuff, which I'm happy to do, or also it does seem superfluous to tell people who know you well.
Yes.
But
But it's good for the, like
The
the
audio?
event, yeah,
Sure,
sure,
perfect.
for the event, sure. I'll be happy to.
Great. Well, good evening and welcome to Majors and Quinn. My name is Michael. I'm a bookseller here. I'm so pleased you'll be joining us to celebrate Don Brockett's book, Unrestricted. A few housekeeping things before we get on with the show. It's going to be a pretty casual conversation tonight and much more of a salon atmosphere than usual. At the end, there will be time for any audience questions and we can have some books signed and sold. If you buy a book here this evening, you are not only supporting the author, but also a locally owned independent bookstore, and we cannot thank you enough. Let me introduce Don Brockett, an author, keynote speaker, professor, advisor in the research and treatment of anorexia, and the managing director of Medical Society. Don was published alongside the powerful stories of many extraordinary women in What Doesn't Kill Her, Women's Stories of Resilience in 2021. In 2023, she released Unrestricted, How I Stepped Off the Tightrope, Learned to Say No, and Silenced Anorexia, a deeply personal story of how one woman stopped disappearing, started listening to her own voice, and claimed her rightful place in the world. Please join me in welcoming Don Brockett.
So huge thank you to Majors and Quinn. The conversation about coming here started last year, and Annie actually asked if we could host during National Eating Disorders Awareness Week, which it is this week.
Oh, okay.
Yes, so it's a real privilege to be here to have this conversation at this time, so thank you so much. So I will start by reading just a couple of portions of the book to kind of frame up the conversation, and then go into questions posed by my incredible wife, Lisa Marie, and then we'll just open the conversation to all few of us. Perfect. So the book is chapter titled in combination Food and Psychology. So the title of this chapter is Salt and Control. Do we want to turn down the music?
Yes.
Okay.
I absolutely should. Sorry.
Okay, no problem.
I agree, I was thinking of that too, but like, they don't want to be very bossy, but maybe a little bossy.
It's fine. I can be as bossy as you like to be. It's not even bossy.
It's great music.
Exactly. It is great music.
We love the music.
I love the music.
But I can't hear Don Brockett speak. They're important.
Thank you. Sorry.
Of course.
Thank you.
Music lovers here, for sure.
Yes.
Great music. Okay, chapter 1, Salt and Control. On the corner of Sun Valley Road and Main Street sits a bustling bistro. Columns of river rock support exposed brick walls. A bar runs the length of the room, heralding a commitment to regional beer and wine. Bartenders at the ready with a sample or a recommend and a backstory. The best seats in the house are benches built into a wall of windows offering a somewhat occluded view of Mount Baldy, the grand dame of the row of peaks that comprise the Sun Valley Ski Resort. Its size and presence providing perennial comfort to the valley below in the way that only tall mountains can. Covered with a thin cushion, the benches form a U of right angles. Bohemian-flavored throw pillows allow one to burrow in for a protracted and cozy dinner, each additional course securing the prized real estate for another fraction of an hour. Here, I have shared meals with my family, my spouse, my dearest friends. New and lasting friendships have emerged out of conversations with neighboring tables in this three-sided, window-fronted getaway. It is a protected and secluded space, one where, more often than not, I dine alone. I practice the provides an opportunity to savor and settle, moseying my way through the uniquely sensual experience of a well-orchestrated and executed meal. In these moments, I am nowhere but here, absorbed by the desire to take it all in, to breathe and smell, taste and touch, see and feel the plated art that the chef has deliberately created. I am wide open, all in. It is a lovely exchange of appreciation, which is to say, presence. Sometimes a flash of inspiration prompts me to write a few words in the notebook that I always carry in my handbag. Other times my bench neighbors will be social and I will oblige. Most often I hold these moments for myself, for the sole purpose of filling my tired, scattered, deadline-driven mind with such an overload of delightful sensory input that all else fades. It is a reliably edifying and balancing ritual. On one such evening, as spring succumbed to summer, when the once vividly white snow at the very top of the governing peak mixed with dirt from May rains, I returned to this dining ritual to peel myself up from feeling stampeded, to become again three-dimensional, to nourish my fading sense of self. With an abundance of irons in the proverbial fire, I needed to withdraw from a few overextending decisions, to recover from guarded space in which to move about freely, and to protect a few pockets of time not bookended by others' needs and urgency. I had become absorbed by the everyday. I had become indistinguishable from my usefulness. A single goblet of an Italian farmhouse red blend lasted all 4 courses. House-made burrata with a wedge of homemade bread, wild yeast leavening Italian wheat, all smothered in the grassiest of olive oils. Mama's salad with globe grapes, kiki arugula, and salty earth pecorino, roasted Brussels with grilled Marcona almonds, sweetened lightly with saba, and the coup de grace, affogato, a homemade vanilla bean gelato drenched tableside with hot, strong, freshly brewed espresso. A timeless marriage of complementary opposites. At the moment of the first kiss, espresso to gelato, a thermodynamic timer begins. All will soon melt and blend into a lukewarm coffee cream soup. The divine experience of this dessert lies in the instant of friendliness, just beyond the stark distinction, the first melding, the curiosity of one substance for another. The dessert derives its name from the Italian word for drowned. My senses still delighted, my mind unburdened, I stepped outside into the cool, early summer evening. Strolling the 3 blocks back to my hotel, the vanilla bean and espresso flavors lingered on the sides of my tongue. Gentle conversations with the neighboring table echoed in my eardrums. Without warning, swooped up from life and dropped unceremoniously onto the battlefield of the mind, I found myself trapped in a psychological flash flood, pressed against invisible walls rising swiftly and jaggedly from the sidewalk, like vertical cliffs, impossible to climb. A random attack. Memories of simple pleasures experienced only a moment ago were ripped away. The emotional rapids rushed me, there would be no escape. Sobs lashed out of me uncontrollably, submerged by this drowning wave, choking their source with gasps of desperation until a wail crept out of my laterally stretched face, a melodrama of sorrow, escaping narrowly as a wounded wild animal from the steel jaws of a hateful trap. The sheer force pummeled shudders through my contracted form, and I spun into a free fall toward the depths of misery, of self-hatred, and self-destruction. I lumbered down the stairs from the sidewalk to my room, leaning all of myself into the door, its weight suddenly incomprehensible. Inside, I collapsed into a sinewy heap on the hotel bed. The monster was back. My annihilation, his goal. So alarming were the sounds coming from my shrinking self that soon a knock came at the door. The hotel manager arrived. He was a thoughtful young man who routinely double-checked my reservation to make certain that my room was conveniently located for my furball of a dog, Coco. Traveling this time without my beloved puppy, I still booked the ground floor, sharing a thin old wall of this ski-bum hotel with the room reserved for the overnight staff. He had no doubt heard every terrible sound. I cracked open the weighted door, present enough to feel a tinge of embarrassment, but without the faculty to shift my current heavy reality. Someone died, I croaked. I am so sorry, he said with warm, sad eyes and a sincerely concerned tone that sounded almost relieved. He had no idea what to do next. There was nothing to do. I closed the door and slid without pause down its back until my bones hit the floor. In a way, my lie was terrifyingly accurate. Someone was dying. Me. Again. And I thought I wanted to this time. God damn it. It is widely accepted that anorectics are perfectionist, risk-averse, and controlling. On the first two, I surrender. Yes, layers and complexity are collapsed into convenient labeling, but all sides of the argument end in nearly the same location. The subtlety is not worth dissecting here. However, with the control claim, I take singular and serious issue. It is a label of false identity, a tool to minimize a corrupting blame misplaced. The anorectic as control freak accusation is a straw man argument. False, evasive of the real problem, easy to destroy. So if a person's goal is to simply destroy her, to define the identity of the shrinking person, to shape her agency in the way that will best reflect onto him, to excise her hope of finding the will to take up a column of self-sustaining space in the world, he should carry on with this self-serving attack on essential humanity. Label her controlling, walk away, feel superior. She will shrink further, and he can puff himself up into the space that she surrenders, feeling deserving about his bloated sense of self-worth, further buoyed by the twisted kindness of the illness. Her guilt for having inconvenienced him by simply existing will drive her to exist less, ever smaller. Space is critical for the integration of one's own identity, separate from others. Overriding this natural universal need for individuation forces the body to create the necessary space by shrinking or fighting or both. This I have learned. To defeat the demon, you must hold your ground and appear large. You must discover and use your voice. You must fully inhabit your space. You must stop depriving yourself to feed him. The potential that fills you, that seeps out through your generosity, it is yours to direct, to fulfill, and at times, to abandon in pursuit of the path of a changed mind. This living is an act of creativity, not of control.
Am I the moderator here, Don Buggy? Okay, so since we have mostly friends in the room here,
Entirely friends.
well, I was gonna say
Michael's a friend.
all friends, but
Yeah.
older friends, newer friends, and I want to direct it in an area that would be most pertinent to what
Yes.
we've got here. So, I think reading that chapter about control, because Michael asked specifically, would be a really good start. I feel like to ask you about, because I know that in the book you're specifically refuting that claim, and because that is an actual, we know, a medical claim of what has been proposed, and there's very little other than that. It'd be maybe a really great thing to talk about, and I'm not sure what the best question would be, because it's such a broad subject, but maybe specifically, you mentioned the actual him is the pronoun that you're using, and I know there's a very specific reason about that, and that might be a great way to maybe fuse the other question that Michael had about what's happening with society there, and then the nature nurture kind of ideas that are all throughout. So however you would want to speak to that, those are big subjects, so
Yeah.
I'll leave it to the wordsmith.
No, let's dive into all those. So, pronoun selection in the book, I call the anorectic her. I call anorexia him. There is a reason for that, and I'll dive into that. Understanding maybe how control is used as a concept currently, medically and socially related to anorexia and anorectics. And then the question that you posed, we were really both excited to talk about, and like, wait, we're doing such a better job understanding, the absurdity of these female ideals, and this generation hasn't been trained in that same way. Why are some of the same, rhetorical adolescent thoughts showing up in young women at this age was happening.
Are we
So-
doing better?
Right.
Well, yeah, and why, and doesn't it seem like we should be?
Right, right. So starting with the pronouns in the book, and of course pronouns are a really large conversation right now that is really important, so it was a very deliberate and careful decision. And it is explained in the book, so if you read it front to back, you walk away with real crystal clarity around why those were selected. But I did not read from that section, so bringing that forward. 90+% of anorectics are women, people who identify as women. So that is a very significant number in mental illness, and it's a very significant number in any illness that isn't very specifically sex related. It's not common to have something so dramatically skewed, and not 100% skewed because of glandular endocrine activity. So as a young woman who was very, very ill with anorexia and who was seeking answers, and who now works tangentially to healthcare and research, I have always been frustrated by the need to translate everything that I read to a woman's perspective, because so much of the research and the literature is done on and written for the masculine perspective. I thought when I was in a position to read something that a young woman who is ill, or to write something that a young woman who is ill might read, I wanted to not require her to translate, which is why I wrote it from a feminine perspective and a feminist perspective for anyone who suffers, but the pronoun choice was very deliberate, that it felt highly relatable in an area where it should feel highly relatable based upon the prevalence. Does that make sense?
Definitely.
Yeah. And then in terms of the selection of anorexia being a man, that's a heck of a thing, because of course anorexia is neurobiological, genetic, with environmental and social triggers. So it does not define itself according to gender. The experience of anorexia that I had, and that everyone I've ever spoken with that has it had, is a persistent voice in one's head. That is the experience of having anorexia, and then the behavior is compelled by that voice, and the behavior causes a number of physiological and psychological changes that become then apparent socially. But the experience of having it feels like the worst human you can imagine constantly is chattering at you, insulting you, and demanding certain behavior. That voice lined up in such parallel to the masculine influences of my early life, and so it felt masculine. I was part of as a child, Christopher Hitchens says there are no religious children, there are parents of religious children. So I was the child of there are children of religious parents, So I was the child of religious parents. They were United Pentecostal, which is an extreme version of even an evangelical sect, just shy, I like to say, of playing with snakes. And it was a very patriarchal religion with a lot of stricture and structure, especially on what women could do and couldn't do. And then a lot of shame and judgment based on the choices that women would make. So that's part of the masculine voice, I think, that was partly integrated into that anorectic voice in my head. The other side of that was that my father is diagnosed as a narcissistic sociopath. And I think that the tone and timbre of that voice in my head also sounded a lot like an integrated version of his treatment of me. So for me, anorexia felt very masculine and parallel to those influences in my early life. And I argue that is, we can get into it further down the line because it needs a little more background before that argument makes full sense, but I argue that has something to do with the development of anorexia and the fact that it affects young women at a rate that is an order of magnitude higher than those of men. That's addressing kind of the pronoun question. Before I go any further, does that raise any other questions related to that?
No, that's so clear. Yeah, to me.
Yeah.
Do you have insight from other surviving specifically why you chose that, and it seemed very apropos when reading the book, but have you found a bit of a consensus with that in the research you've done and interactions you've had with other people?
It's such a great question, and the consensus is yes, from a stereotypical masculine voice, right? Please recognizing that there are many masculine voices that don't sound anything like anorexia, but that sort of stereotypical masculine voice that is extremely critical of, judgmental of, defining of a young woman and her possibilities, yes. The consensus, in my own anecdotal experience, is that it sounds a lot like that. In terms of the literature, it isn't a theory that I'm aware of that has been researched, so it really isn't, I don't know that we have any, beyond anecdotal evidence, any body of evidence there, but having spent a good amount of time with many other folks who are ill and having kind of seen some of these patterns, it seems to make sense to me, but a lot of the theories that I posit here are fairly new to the field and haven't been researched, and hopefully one day, we'll discover whether they have merit.
When we're moving on, if you're kind of segueing into maybe going further into what Michael was asking about that piece, I'm wondering also about speaking to the part that, well, first of all, you're talking about your home environment. That's one piece. And we're talking about society as a voice, a masculine voice as well in that. And then, of course, the neurobiological, which you talked about in your brain, and sort of that perfect storm idea. So we understand that sort of with the statistics. And then for you to sort of maybe, as you're working into that question, like, I love hearing, when we talk about it, I love hearing your perspective on, I guess the statistics from all the way back, that this has been around far longer than all the things, social media, all the other factors. We know these kind of things are true because you've done that research, right? And so maybe like bringing people up to date there, starting with understanding those numbers and then addressing today's society, which is kind of relevant for the people here, I guess.
Yeah, let me dive into all of that. And I think sometimes it's helpful, just because we didn't get into such a substantial piece of the reading that you learned about my own background with anorexia. So between the ages of 15 and about 21, I was acutely ill with anorexia and what I consider to be sort of two bouts. Anorexia is defined as a severe mental illness with levels of severity itself, and I would have been considered severely ill for many years. In short, I'm just really lucky to be here. Statistically, since the data has been tracked, anorexia nervosa is the deadliest mental illness of all mental illnesses. And as I just said, I'll say it again, and always has been. It is 2 to 5 times, has a 2 to 5 time higher mortality rate than the second deadliest mental illness, which is schizophrenia. And this is not to create some sort of, superiority. It's, it's a horrible superiority, if it's a superiority. One of the reasons I wrote the book and take the time to have these conversations is to shed light in a space, on a space that is largely ignored. And part of doing that is to share the importance of it, the severity of it, and the deadliness of it that I think is often surprising to people. So anytime it starts to sound comparative, this mental illness versus that mental illness, that is never the intention. It's a matter of demonstrating, hey, we understand this is really serious. This is too. So anorexia, the deadliest mental illness, it affects women at a rate of 10 to 1 versus men. And again, that has always been the case. Its prevalence is about 1%, equal to that of schizophrenia. So the likelihood of any one person born on this planet of at some point being diagnosed or diagnosable with anorexia is 1 in 100. So that just defines kind of its severity. It was recognized millennia ago, literally, and was codified into the first DSM, Diagnostics and Statistics Manual, which is for psychiatry, the text that tells you what you can or cannot diagnose, can or cannot treat, and can or cannot bill for. It was the only eating disorder in that particular text. And again, that was more than 70 years ago. The mortality rates have not decreased since then. is no FDA-approved medication or treatment of any kind for anorexia. And again, for a comparator, mortality rates for other mental illnesses generally have decreased as treatment availability has increased. And the number of available FDA-approved medications for schizophrenia is 132 versus 0. That's on label, not to mention off label. Anorexia doesn't have the privilege of either. Nothing that's been thrown at it is shown to work. So why is it just that difficult? Well, sure, it's very difficult. So is schizophrenia. So is bipolar, and so are most mental illnesses, if not all, to treat. The fact is that very little research and funds have been thrown at it. So present day, for any individual diagnosed with anorexia, 73 cents per person of federal research funding is available for anorexia. Compare that to, again, schizophrenia, because it's kind of its closest comparator in terms of prevalence, severity, that kind of thing, which is why I use it. It's nearly $87 per person. It's a greater than 100x differentiator. So there are reasons why we don't have the data that we need on anorexia, and it's a funding issue, and funding comes down to priority. So why have we not prioritized the deadliest mental illness? And this is where I'll say something that some might think is inflammatory, and for me it seems incredibly obvious, and forgive me, Zoe, for this reality, but this society does a really good job of showing we don't really give a shit about women, especially when it comes to their well-being and healthcare and ability to individuate and decide for themselves, particularly in areas that affect their bodies. So from my perspective, and I claim that very overtly in my writing, because it seems fairly obvious, frankly, at this point, the deadliest mental illness that affects women at an order of magnitude more frequently than men is funded at a literal less than 1% fraction of the next deadliest mental illness, and we've shown 0 progress in terms of mortality or even available treatments. So that's where we stand right now. That's a depressing place to be. So hopefully we'll walk to a different place through this conversation, but that's where we're starting today. It's where we were 70 years ago. It's probably where we've always been in this conversation. The control issue, I see it as an issue. The control claim, a more neutral way of saying that. Psychiatry claims, and I'll explain where and how it makes this claim, that control, meaning an anorectic's desire to control herself and those around her, is the propelling force behind the behavior. How do we know that? To be diagnosed with anorexia, you have to take the eating disorder examination questionnaire. And the eating disorder examination questionnaire has been around since time and eternity, with very little to no change, and it reads as such. Unfortunately, it reads like an ancient document. And there are many, many measures, kind of sub-measures of this larger measure, and more than a dozen. And as the final line of each of these measures, which are mostly behavioral, the line says something along the lines of, do you behave in this way in order to feel like you're in control? To the point where, if you read through it as a document, it starts to feel almost like a brainwashing exercise. Like, do you do all of these things? Are you successful in your destructive behavior? There's literally a framing of success in the most negative way. And then, do you behave in this way because you're being controlling? And it just starts to cycle in this very destructive pattern. And that's our FDA-approved measurement.
Sounds almost accusatory in some
It's
question.
highly accusational. And it's exactly how I felt when I was young and diagnosed and very ill. When I did seek treatment, or really was put into treatment, by my parents, I had a very negative experience simply because anyone who is seen in a way that you know is not true about you, it just immediately raises a flag and a certain amount of resistance, and certainly not a lot of confidence that that person is going to be able to take care of the bigger problems going on. So what I learned when I went into treatment very early at the age of probably 16 was that I was manipulative, malevolent, and controlling, and that was kind of the and obstinate, and those were what those behaviors were, what were compelling, the behavior that was ultimately trying to kill me. You can imagine I disagreed. And I disagree to this day. And what I find really interesting, I'll actually just read this little piece on the back of the book, is that, again, one of the reasons that I'm in conversation consistently with neuroscientists at the highest level, including the National Institute of Mental Health and other organizations, saying we've got to see this differently, is because we have modernized mental illness all along the way, especially in the last 50 years, which is beautiful and brilliant. We have more work to do there. One area in which we need to really turn our attention and modernize the perception and the treatment of it, and certainly the vocabulary, which is driven by the perception, is anorexia. Dr. Murali Doraiswamy, on the back cover of my book, he's the head of psychiatry at Duke University, the former co-chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Mental Health. He calls the book a powerful call to action for the field to modernize the perception and treatment of anorexia, which impacts more than 80 million women worldwide and carries the highest mortality rate of mental illness. And when you read a lot of the perceptions or become aware of kind of how it's actually treated today, it starts to feel a lot like how hysteria was treated when it had some sense of validity in psychiatry. So it's just a great time to say, hey, let's not leave this deadliest one behind while we modernize our perception around all things psychiatry and mental illness.
So with furthering that into so we know, we have these numbers, we have these statistics, and then, okay, so we need more research, we need more money, we haven't really got a lot of data. And the information that we have is what you described. It's abstinence control. So this is the axiom that you talk about. This is the axiom from which we treat and look at anorexia. And so if your axiom's wrong, then obviously you're not going to get the outcome is always going to be the same, right? So you're proposing a different, a different, based on your experience, I know, but you're proposing a different solution based on your own experience, but also you've also said you've talked to a lot of other girls, and it seems to be, everybody you talk to seems to have they agree with you on all points, right? You don't have I don't think you've said you've had very many say, no, that's not my experience. I feel like you've talked to so many, and you're safe to talk to because you aren't telling them what the medical community is. They see when you say this, they'll go, oh my God, and then they want to talk to you, which is what I've seen. So because it seems like you're onto something, I think we can go maybe more into Michael's second question, even deeper into, okay, so yeah, we don't have data, whatever, but aren't we doing better with girls? We're not controlling them as much. We're allowing them, more freedom. We're caring more about what the kids think. When I grew up, you need to be seen and not heard. You don't have a voice, whatever, the old-fashioned way. Now kids they get to make choices when they're 3 and 4 and 5. Okay, so what do you say about that modern environment, and why would women still be struggling with anorexia if we're doing better?
Yeah, so let me get into that. So one thing I always like to say around this point is I am not a doctor, and I'm not claiming to have any medical expertise in this area whatsoever. I have experiential expertise. I have not spoken with the 80 million women or 80 million people worldwide with anorexia. I've spoken with a lot. Certainly not that full number, so I don't claim to speak for the patient population or with medical expertise. I just like to make that very clear. I'm speaking from my own personal experience, a lot of engagement in trying to understand that, and then additional engagement with patients and clinicians in the space. But that's as far as my expertise goes. It's a theory that I posit, and I'll be kind of excited to see where all that goes, but I just want to be clear about that limitation. So the theory that I posit is that it's not control, it's a matter of feeling controlled, of being controlled, and it's a desire to shrink to the space you're allowed to take up in your life. I think of anorexia as a shrinking until death, not as a controlling to some sort of eventual positive outcome. There's no positive outcome. I think that at the age at which, somewhere between the age of, onset of puberty, 13 to 15, these are kind of the average. I realize those are two different numbers, but these are kind of the average onset moments of anorexia. I think that right at that juncture, where especially the young woman is starting to expand and grow in every way, certainly not just physically, there is this compulsion then to shrink and stop that growth. And I say shrink to the space that you're allowed to take up in your life, and that space is defined by others, whether they're parental, religious authorities, even social, obviously, is a huge influence, and that's what we're going to talk about here more so in a minute. But that is my theory, and then it builds out, in many ways on top of that concept that has some validity from some research that I learned about after publishing the book from Amy Cuddy. So let's talk about that, because I think
Yeah,
that's
I was gonna
actually
bring that up. It's great.
that's actually really relevant to your question, which was how is this still happening? We're doing so much better. Unfortunately, a recent CDC report on what they said, girls in America, and girls as defined high school young women, high school age young women, they're not doing well at all in terms of mental health, and in a positive direction. It's actually a massive backslide. So we know for sure things are unfortunately not going well, in spite of a better understanding of treatment of young women from a parenting perspective. So Dr. Amy Cuddy, a social psychologist who spent a lot of her career at Harvard, now at UCLA, famous for a TED Talk on essentially the impact of how you hold in yourself in space, and how that affects your psychology, how that affects others' perception of you, and as a result, how that affects your entire life, including opportunities that become available to you, things you're willing to pursue, that kind of thing. That is the core of her research, if I can claim that. She and her team at Harvard, not too long ago, did a study to understand the point at which our stereotypes are set around gender. The assumption is that's the age of 5, and most of our stereotypes are set. By the age of 5, we know exactly how to categorize or miscategorize a person based on those stereotypical principles. So she and her team took a cohort of 4-year-olds and a cohort of 6-year-olds and asked them to, and with those groups, they took art posing dolls. So these are wooden, genderless art posing dolls. You can imagine these like little wooden dolls. And positioned them in 2 different types of ways. 32 dolls, but all different types of ways. So a kind of space-taking way, or a constricted, closed manner. 16 in each of those categories. And asked the 4-year-olds to select the gender of each doll. Of course, with nothing defining the gender of the doll. And then did the same with the 6-year-olds. The majority of the 4-year-olds chose the constricted, shrinking forms to be women and girls, and the open, free, liberated, space-taking forms to be men. The 6-year-olds were 100% each camp. It's terrifying. Out of Harvard recently. So 6-year-olds know that this is a woman. This. That's very concerning, because what happens, for many reasons, one of which is what happens at a certain age, right at the age of average onset of anorexia, which I think may not be coincidental, and obviously there's a lot more to it, but right at the age that you are no longer able to maintain that stereotype, there is a dramatic instinct to shrink. We see this in diet culture, which is a terrible thing, not nearly as severe as anorexia, and they are remarkably different things. I want to be clear about that. But in many ways, intellectually, socially, financially, in terms of opportunity, educationally, fill in the blank with words that you can add ly onto, and physically, we see young women start to pull back and start to shrink. Add neurobiology biology and some other issues on top of that. And of course, again, I'm not saying this is how anorexia happens, but I absolutely believe that it is a part of it, and I think in some cases it could be sufficient. All the pieces are in place for young women to have received the message through myriad avenues that they are to shrink compared to the allowable growth for men. And then when nature works against you and you're growing in every way, intellectually, physically, spiritually, socially, educationally, then I think that instinct can really kick in and become quite compelling.
Does that help?
Yeah, so I guess my what I had always been told, I'm sure it was wrong to a certain extent, was that generally speaking, young girls who've had very traumatic childhoods are looking for some measure not to try and control others, but rather to finally exert some control over their own body. They've been denied control their whole lives, and this becomes the act. And I'm still not 100% sure whether that's consistent. Is anorexia an act of defiance against those who have tried to make you shrink, or is it an act of conformity to try and do that thing which they're asking of you? Is it
Juicy question.
Woo! Yes. That is such a beautiful
really
question.
good.
So I think there's complexity to it, but if I have to choose one or the
Right.
other, it's conformity
okay?
from my perspective. Defiance is what gets you out of it. Yeah, let's dive more into that. That's incredible. That's a great question. So speaking for myself, I'm going to go back to my N of 1, and then I'll try to expand it out beyond that, recognizing I'm most comfortable in my N of 1. I learned from a really extremely controlling, behaviorally, religion, especially of women, and a father who determined my value based upon what I did, who I was, how I looked, everything reflected on him, right? While at the same time getting a pretty big kick out of causing harm in any way that you can. That's the narcissism plus the sociopathy. I learned a lot about my worth through that process. I integrated, and of course it was a very low sense of self-worth, and it was completely defined by how my behavior lined up with these really bizarre, truly really aberrant expectations. But to me, I didn't know they were bizarre or aberrant. These were the expectations that were placed on me. So at my own experience of anorexia was an absolute, it was conformity to that template while nature was working against that template. My mind is expanding, right? My capabilities are expanding. I'm starting to, as a young woman, kind of just without even trying, violate some of the tenets of what I had been taught. And I think that my anorexia was a way of, I think the reason I went into anorexia and not into something else at that point was that it was a compulsion toward conformity while trying to play out the natural expansion that happens at that time. Now that sounds counterintuitive because nothing I was doing was expanding. I argue that when you're being pushed in on all sides, and I felt like I was, this is not a response to feeling like you can take up space. This is a response to feeling like there's only so much space you have in order to take up, right? So this is really finding more space between yourself and another. I only have this much. The man next to me has far more. If I don't want to feel the pressure, I have to kind of shrink so that I'm no longer, of course it doesn't work that way because it just keeps coming in. But I see it as a shrinking to have enough space to be able to individuate within that space. But the problem is you shrink so much and the pressure keeps coming in that you never have a chance. So I think it is both a conformity and not a defiance, but kind of an effort to do the natural thing that you feel like you're being denied. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. I do think there is a strong opinion. It's also written about in one of the blurbs of this really preeminent psychiatrist. There's a strong opinion about the obstinance of anorexia. And I think that comes down to its difficulty to treat. And that young women, when they're in the throes of it, you know, the insights I have now, I had none of those then. I had not one of these insights in the acute stages. This came much later upon reflection. But I think that the difficulty to treat the severity, the fact that it affects young women, map that to a profession that at the time that it was first kind of being codified into the DSM and others was really almost exclusively male. I think there was a frustration and kind of almost an ego insult with those male clinicians that they couldn't get anywhere with these girls. So rather than saying, wait, we must not understand this, let's take a step back and figure it out, the blame was transferred. And rather than being, you know, severely mentally ill, socially imposed upon in every possible way you can imagine, and trying to cope through all of that, suddenly you're obstinate. So I think a lot of that idea of defiance and obstinance is still very strongly related to anorectics on a perception basis, and I think it's extremely incorrect and damaging. Yeah.
I have a bit of an evolution on that, if that's okay.
Yeah.
That I'd like to ask about.
Yeah.
So, kind of tying a few strands together, you were very blunt in saying that society doesn't give a shit about this. So, in between your question and what you just touched on, I was going to have you elaborate a little bit more on the patriarchal influence that you think this has had on things, and to what you were just saying in the sense of, you know, if you have male dominant research on this that are being offended because they can't solve it, so they're passing the blame. One thing I'd like to have you elaborate on along with that as well is in the sense of fairly recently there has been a large change in the perception of suicide. So there has been a lot more compassion tied to it. So in the sense of you're not committing suicide, you completed suicide. There's more compassion to it, there's more love associated with it, it's more of a loss because it's a terrible, horrible thing, because the loss of control that's leading you to that, it's no longer being perceived as like a criminal thing. So you're seeing an evolution of the research of something like suicide because there's more compassion associated with it. So would you be willing to tie in kind of that
Thank you so much.
patriarchal perception of it, and then how can we get a little bit more of that compassion into it instead of like passing the blame
Yeah.
onto the poor person?
That's a beautiful question. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I would love to tackle that. One of the clinicians who wrote some words about the book tied the perception of suicide to the perception of anorexia. Like you knew it. I don't know that you did, but let me just read his words if that's okay. Most important is her central thesis about control and power. In essence, the confusion is over the need of the anorectic to control something. In my 40 years of mental health practice, I've always believed this about anorexia myself. Many well-meaning therapies often intensify the pain, not heal it. People fail to realize that this control is to anorexia as suicide is to depression. In neither case is dramatic action itself the problem, yet in both cases the action is a vehicle or tool to solve a deeper problem. So the problem is not suicide, it's hopelessness. Right? And I think anorexia is also a hopelessness. I think it is rife with potential for compassion. And I think that my frustration as I was in it and recovering from it, and before I really dove in, and I still have frustration about it, but it's more alchemized into something more useful, is that it's just mischaracterized. So the anorectic, it is not a path we would choose. Can you imagine if you actually had control and had say and were individuating? This is not a path one would choose. I feel like the idealization of it and the lack of compassion around it comes from this many things. The fact that it affects young women, the fact that it's been for so long mischaracterized and that we haven't just stopped to hold that up and look at it and say, very young women, tremendous social pressures, probably lots of childhood trauma, almost certainly some extreme overbearing force in her life, probably exceptional in many ways, obviously struggling, literally slow suicide, yet we don't choose compassion as a society. We choose to to throw obstinance and manipulation, and it is bizarre to me. I think it has a lot to do with just what has always been believed, and I think that has a lot to do with extreme sex discrimination. So I think that's the gap in compassion, which is why I start with a lot of the statistics that I start with, which is, erase everything you think you know about anorexia. These are the facts. What does that lead you to? It leads most thinking people to, oh my God, we need to do something about this. Are we? Funding says no. Research says no. If we have continued down the same path with the same theory for all this period of time, my undergraduate philosophy degree says, question your axiom. Me taking issue with the control issue is me questioning the axiom. I think that because the axiom has proven nothing, right? The axiom has not proven its worth. We need to question the axiom. How we find compassion, I think, is to literally face the current view in the same way we did with hysteria, in the same way we did with homosexuality, in the same way we did with a number of items in the DSM. Does anorexia belong in the DSM? Absolutely. It is a severe mental illness. I'm not comparing it to hysteria and homosexuality, and that if they're not really mental illnesses, need to be removed. That's not what I mean. What I mean is the perception of them was so aberrant that then they no longer even classified, right? It needs to be re-perceived. It is still absolutely a severe mental illness. So I think the compassion is just a matter of, it's almost like a social reality check.
Updating the software.
Yes.
Of society. So if the axiom is different, not control, and we're coming from a place of this poor girl is literally in her life feels the pressure of society. There's clearly going to be some component, and it could be, maybe it's not it doesn't have to be a narcissistic father with sociopathy or whatever it's called. So is that it? It doesn't have to be that. It could be an overbearing mother who doesn't, who has expectations. It could be another family member. It could be someone you look up to that's a figure that's not even a family member
Someone
that
you've given power to.
So it could be a lot of those things, right? So we know there's a component there. There's also society's expectations. Then if you compound that with a religion or a suppressive religion, it's typically more suppressive for the women. We know that. Then we've got potentially a neurological component.
Neurological component.
So,
it demonstrated crystal clear no neurological component.
So there might be a propensity, we think, because mental illness, we're going to think there's something in the brain. It's not just you're starving, yes, but like you said, there's something going on. It's not just I'm being obstinate, right? If you're compelled towards death, it makes sense that there's something going on.
You're not manipulating everyone around you so you can die.
Yeah. Doesn't seem like it's logical.
Right.
Yeah. So if we're
look what I won.
Right. Look at me. This is so delightful. I'm winning. Yay!
Right. It's really
I'm winning
absurd.
at dying, and I'm being obstinate towards you. I'm going to die. I'll show you.
I'll show you.
Then maybe that's like with suicide stuff. Like it's really tragic, right? That there is that. Maybe they feel like they're depressed, and depression gives them that thought process that nobody cares, and so it's a mental illness.
It feels like a lack of other options, I think.
Right.
Yeah, and it's to relieve a pain that you've not found another way to relieve, right? I think many really excellent psychiatrists now view suicide in this way, and I'm not saying it's the right way to view it, but I think it's seen as if I may, like a very dramatic form of pain relief. Anorexia is the same. It's a very dramatic form of pain relief. It's painful to try to expand into space when no one will allow you to do so. It is very painful to try to individuate when every message you're getting overtly and otherwise, is shaming you for doing so, or kind of pushing you back into a corner for doing so. You both, there's a giving up, but there's also okay, if I give you all the space you need, can I have this? Because I'll try to do it in here. Oh, I can't have that. Can I have this? Okay, I'm gonna try to individuate from right here. Cool. Do you have enough? Like, are you good? Right. I mean, that's the experience of anorexia from my perspective, and it ties into patriarchy because all too often, the thing taking up that space, at least in my experience, felt quite masculine. And I think it also ties to our stereotypes where there's an allowance for masculinity to be space taking. There's far less of an allowance for feminine. Think of like the from tone of voice to loudness of vehicles. Can we talk about that? My God. To like all like the many ways in which like men just very stereotypically take up so much fucking space. It's like, how much do you need? Like you also need to like stink up my entire porch while you drive by because that makes you feel what? Okay, cool. Like that is such a masculine in so many ways. There's just this lack of concept of the fact that you're even taking up space. Whereas, if a woman talks a bit too loud, I mean, it's so dramatically different. And that's back to your question around kind of how that's a silly way of talking about it, but we're talking about so much heavy stuff. I want to talk back to vehicles for a minute, but I think that is the feeling of the patriarchy, is that it is far more typical and stereotypical in today's society, and certainly in society prior to today, for a woman feeling fully individuated with permission to do whatever she wants to be wondered about than a man doing the same thing.
So if we're talking about back to that axiom concept where I'm saying like, so basically, if you're, it's when you were saying there's, it's so painful to push, but yet starving is so painful. It's pretty profound to say it's more painful to push against you and society than it is to literally shrink so much that I starve myself. That's a very, I think, potent statement in and of itself if we really think about it, right? Because we're compelled toward homeostasis as human beings. So for you to override that, the brain's got something serious going on, and why? And you're saying the why. So that's the axiom. You're saying your why, and a lot of people are agreeing with you in the experience realm, and a lot of the practitioners, I understand, weren't listening to the experience. They're not listening to the women saying, that's not what it is. They're saying, well, this is what we know, and then they're forcing it on them, which is just another way of taking up their space, which makes them sicker.
Correct.
So we kind of
with
understand
no proof
this.
that what they know has yielded
Right.
any benefit.
So if we're changing the axiom, when we bring it to the compassion part, and that's kind of where I want to head, is and I can even speak with my own experience, my own understanding, because anorexia, from living with Dawn, I know, is a lifelong event happening here. Even though she's not starving herself, you're dealing with the mental brain of an anorectic your whole life, and you're managing it, just like any person would in their mental illness. And I know that understanding it from a different perspective, when the behaviors come up, for me, has shifted every way that I understand it so that I can behave differently, which brings compassion rather than frustration. So when we change the axiom to something more like this poor girl, is literally doesn't feel like she is allowed to have any space in the room. She's being suppressed. Her voice is being silenced. She's not allowed to grow boobs or anything else to be a woman and say, look, here I'm expanding. I'm becoming a woman, and I've got my own thoughts now. Whatever it is, right? Like you're talking about. If we change the dialogue and say, so this girl isn't allowed to do any of this, and we can see that there's society, there's her environment, and there's also a neurobiology happening. We can probably have a lot more, if we take the control of that, we could probably say, well, shit, and she's compelled to starve herself because it's less painful than this. I feel like then we can maybe talk about, if we change the conversation, which is what you're trying to do, that's the goal, to change the conversation so the axiom's different, right? Then potentially would the compassion come in, because it has for me. Do you see it that way in the world when you've been talking? Do you have light bulbs where people get it and you feel like they understand it and they're more compassionate? Do you think it would work in society? And how do we make that happen? That's another big piece of the question. How do we get to these? I know you're talking to a lot of practitioners, but how do we get them to see the axiom different and then give women compassion about it?
I love that. Thank you. I do think that compassion is really not far away from just that kind of, hey, outside of what you've become accustomed to thinking, let's take it out here. Let's look at this belief. Let's question it. Let's tie it back to what you know about me, what you know about other human beings who have dealt with this and continue to deal with this condition, what you know about other mental illnesses, other ways in which you've updated your software. Let's really think about it. Does this make any sense? And if you want to stand that ground, I will confront you with the data that you've gotten nowhere from this place. So it's so far.
Now you're saying you're going to use math and science for this?
It's crazy.
Like facts and statistics?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And you know, I think we talk about this a lot. When I first wrote this book, and I get to work in a space where I'm working with the National Institute of Mental Health and the White House and pharma companies. There's one that I'm aware of that's really working in anorexia, and I advise on their trials, and I have the opportunity to have access and conversations with folks who are really leading the charge in psychiatry nationally and internationally, which is remarkable. I have yet to have any real pushback. The only pushback I ever received was when I was going into publication with the book from like friends who were psychiatrists who assumed I would receive pushback, kind of this care, like, hey, just know you're going up against the party line. I think you're right. Be prepared. I haven't received it. And I think we're moving now into more of a society where, you know, if I may, like male ego is still there, but it's just less justified. And it has less supporting structure and a lot more questioning. And I think that this is really built on the back of that. And so as that, you know, just has a lot less stability, it feels like it's a little easier to fall. We just haven't quite taken it, looked at it and said, hey, this too, let's update this too. And by the way, let's give it some funding so that we can treat it like the deadliest mental illness that it is, with the same prevalence of schizophrenia, which has the same funding as Alzheimer's, which has a moonshot funding behind it. Like, let's just catch up. Give schizophrenia more, please. Give Alzheimer's more. Just let's give something to anorexia. So I think that the compassion is actually not far away. I think it's just a matter of seeing, of really looking at it outside of your own head and kind of being reminded of how absurd that sounds and how we've gotten nowhere with that theory. That's been my experience so far.
Do you guys, I mean, I'm asking all the questions, but does anybody else have any other questions that they want to ask or know about?
If not, do we want to do some book signing? Do we want to?
Yeah, let's do it.
I have one real quick, if that's okay.
Yeah.
To what you were talking about, and this I think was part for us starting the formal conversation, but we were talking about social media influence and things like
Yes.
that. But to your very point of masculinity versus femininity, there was a very small moment in time where I had some hope with this, but fitness seemed like it could be a good way to spark some positivity towards body image, because there was a push 5-8 years ago in the sense of like strong, because to what you were saying, men can work out, men can lift weights, men can get bigger, totally fine, but women had to be lithe or lean or again smaller, like
Not
you
bulk
work,
up.
yeah, you work out to be thin. And you even see this, you know, with action movies. Like, okay, you have women in action movies now, great, step forward, but it's still lean as opposed to strong. And there was a moment where you had strong for fitness when it came to women, but how quickly that turned into thin all over again. Like there was a brief moment where like, no, you can be strong, you can do this, like you can be just as, if not more powerful than men. And then I don't even think it made it a year before that got flipped into thin all over again. I would love your opinion on how that evolution happens and what ways there are to create a space for power to be able to take up more space and not have that societal flip into what the original intent was supposed to be. I think that's poorly phrased, but
No,
do
it's
you get where I'm
beautifully
going with
phrased.
that?
You'll tell me if I answer it for sure, but I think it's a fixed mindset. So what we're working with is, this idea that women are supposed to show up a certain way, right? And we have this very interesting ideal. Don't let me wrap the question before I address social media, anorexia, and ideals, and that
Yeah,
too.
I wanted you to touch on
I'll get there.
the look, the
Mhm.
thin, the
Yeah,
look. Yeah,
I'll get
we've
there.
talked about this a little earlier, Zoe and I, so.
So there is an ideal that is narrower in scope for women than it is for men. There are ideals for both, but the challenge with the one for women is it is much narrower in scope and is arguably not attainable by the majority of those who are expected to meet it. That's a problem. That is a fixed mindset of society, and it becomes embraced as a fixed mindset of individuals. And those sort of things are driven by beliefs. And when I talk about this, I talk a lot about beliefs, and that's because I was a philosophy major. And I learned that 99.9% of what I do in any given moment, all day long when I'm not thinking about it, I think I'm a good person, and I think I'm making the right choices. All of those actions, decisions, behaviors are driven by my beliefs. So are yours, so are yours, so are yours. Every single person's, you don't get away from it. You better know what your beliefs are. You better know what's driving all of your behavior and choices all of the time. Unless you are immediately reacting to someone in your world that is shifting that temporarily, right? The vast majority of everything we do is driven by our beliefs, and they are, for most people, blind to their own beliefs. Right? So when you are 4, you don't believe, you don't think you believe. If I said, dear 4-year-old, do men deserve to take up more space than women? I don't know of many 4-year-olds who would say yes, right? Or dear 6-year-old, like, should a woman, have as little possibility for movement and comfort as possible? No, but give them the exercise and their beliefs become incredibly apparent. Those are socially constructed, socially reinforced in so many ways that in one generation of better behavior, we have not rooted them out, right? And we won't for a very long time. So I think one of the ways to move beyond our current concept of anorexia, our current concept of the feminine ideal, fill in the blank, our current concept of anything, is to really interrogate the beliefs behind them and do that actively with those who might be holding those beliefs without even realizing it, and say, let's talk about how ridiculous this is, and cognizantly replace your belief with one that you've interrogated and chosen to agree with. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
I think that's the way forward for many, many, many things, but I definitely think that the feminine ideal, if you're going to go up against what it is socially, and you have any chance at retaining a healthy sense of what that is, you have to fundamentally change your belief system about it. Otherwise, you will just go right back to what has been given to you. And then I want to say 2 more quick things. Anorexia is a severe mental illness, and that means something. There are many mental illnesses, and there are a few that are considered severe. That's a clinical term. It predated social media. I said this once at a talk, and I love it, and so now I say it every time. Anorexia was around when social media was tribal gossip. Right? Anorexia has nothing to do with social media. Nothing. Zero. Is it exacerbated by many things, including sports that expect an irrational degree of thinness and don't allow for, body change over time? Yeah, of course. Many things exacerbate it. Is it caused by it? Absolutely not. There's no way. It is part of our society now, and I think society, so I'm going to turn around a little bit of what I said, but I think society alone can be a cause if you have the neurobiological structure in place. I had the privilege of having parent, religion, and society.
You had the trifecta.
I had
Sweet.
the Holy Trinity. Yeah, and I'm sure others have far more than that. I would absolutely argue that a society alone is enough, though. And I suppose if I believe that, and I think that social media is now a part of that society, then perhaps it is alone enough, but the neurobiology has to be in place. But I would see it then as a part of the societal influence that has been, embraced by social media. It's not just social media, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And then the last thing I want to say is that two things. I think that anorexia is so often misconceived as something very shallow. It is body image and desire for an ideal, and it is young women trying to look a certain way. Like skeletal, nearly dead, really? I mean, is that anyone's actual aim? Unless there's something else going on, of course not. So it is not transient, it is not a phase. 5% of anorectics die in 4 years, 10%, 10 years, 20%, 20 years, and go out to the end of their lives, and a third of anorectics die. That's not a phase. And it's not an attempt to meet an ideal, strictly. It's a severe mental illness that needs to be treated as such and taken as seriously. That said, last thing, the strong motivation is a part of what keeps me very stable where I am. So I think we all have an idea of kind of how we're comfortable physically, and it doesn't have to be some crazy ideal, but I think we all have a sense of like, yeah, this feels good, something else doesn't feel good. My new definition of what feels good, because I can't trust my own. So the one I impose upon myself is strong. And it really works awesome for me. And it's not sufficient for recovery, obviously, but it is definitely one of the pillars I have in place of kind of redefining my own expectations for myself. So it hasn't been completely lost. I still hold on.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know we're at time.
Yeah.
So unless Zoe has a question. No? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
Oh my gosh. Wow. So, do you want to sign some
I'd
books?
love to. Yes,
Sure.
please.
Let's do that.
Don, are you gonna sign books for the store? So if
Yes.
they,
Yeah, let's absolutely. We'll do
that's
that. And then
rad.
we'll
So
put
if they buy
little
the book,
stickers
it's got
on
a signature.
those.
That's cool.
Let's do maybe. Yeah, that's
We already
seems like
solved
enough
all
for
this
the
before the
song.
talk. We already talked about a lot of this.
So
We already
the
had
other
that.
thing I'd always been taught
Same
was
idea.
that anorexia was just a severe form of OCD. Is that not? I guess it doesn't respond to OCD treatments.
So it's not a severe form of OCD, but it is, there are consistent comorbidities with anorexia. The
Right.
strongest comorbidity by far is anxiety. It's not 100%, but boy, it's at least in the 80s. It's very high. OCD is probably in the like 40 to 50%
okay.
range. So it's a good marker, but it's not even always comorbid. I think the psychiatrist that I've worked with has said, and I think he's just being kind, but he says I have OCP, which is obsessive compulsive personality, which evidently is something shy of OCD. I don't know, whatever, but whatever. I've got it. I'm
That's
like
new
whatever you need to
letters.
say to make me feel good. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So I don't know that I meet a lot of what you would think of in terms of like the real clinical, like I need to do this X number of
Right.
times, or I feel like something terrible is going to happen.
Right.
But compulsion is definitely part of anorexia. It is part of my control conversation is that I'm not controlling anything. I'm being controlled out here and
Right.
in here, and that controlling voice in here compels behavior. I'm not choosing my behavior. In fact, when I do, I am punished severely up here by the compelling voice. So that compulsion is a really significant part of it. So the extent to which they're conflated, I think, would be the compulsion of that
but it still
voice.
doesn't respond to treatment to medication for
so-
anxiety or OCD.
Because
and-
of the dopamine,
Exactly.
serotonin reversal
Yeah.
in the
So-
brain.
So anorectics, she just nailed it.
Yeah.
So anorexia does have preclinical, obviously acute clinical and post-clinical presentation in the brain that is different than a normal brain. And that's been shown by Walter Kay's research at UC San Diego and many others, but his, I think, is just phenomenal, he and his team. Dopamine behaves differently. So as an anorectic brain, I have different levels of the different types of dopamine that are kind of, slightly reversed from what you would expect, and they match with different receptors. So the dopamine activity in my brain is different.
Gotcha.
So treating anorexia with dopaminergic agents is a very, very, very bad idea, because the body just doesn't respond. It can
Right.
actually be extremely problematic. So every psychiatric medication basically out there has been thrown at it. Just none of them work for it. So we just need to, actually study it.
Yeah.
See what's going on with it. But you wouldn't be wrong to think there's some relationship between OCD and anorexia.
Thank you so much.
But there's not, anorexia can absolutely stand on its own. You can have that
Right.
and nothing else. Just anxiety is by far the most common.
I also noticed you call people suffering from anorexia anorectics as
Mhm.
opposed to anorexics. I'm
Yes.
assuming this is a movement in some way too.
No, it's
just
actually always been the correct way. People just say
Oh,
anorexics.
really?
Yep.
Huh.
Yeah,
There you
it's
go.
not actually any change. It's just it's one of those
You-
weird, like, linguistic things
Interesting.
that has always been the case.
I
Yeah.
had no idea.
Yeah, it's anorectic. And I'm not even sure why that is, but yeah, that's not
Yeah.
anything new. Yeah.
Tom Brockett.
Yes, sir.
I'm speaking on behalf of somebody, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think someone would like a copy of the book to maybe have a signature on it, if that's possible.
Heck yeah, I'd love to.
Oh, really? Really?
What?
She's not gonna bite you. You got the book. Michael, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Michael, that was
Thank
so
you.
awesome.
Oh,
Your
thank you.
questions ruled.
Oh, well, thank